issue.
Welcome to the fine print, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Caleb Teskey, and today I am welcomed again by Amelia Grace and her two dogs.
Oh my goodness, they're all about the loving today.
Sorry to jumpstart that interview. I couldn't help myself.
No, you're good.
I want to thank you for joining me again, Amelia. I've made it long enough to have return guests here, so I suppose that's a good thing. I really was hoping that, it's been about 4 months since we did our last interview, but I was really hoping to sort of dial in on the medical program here in Vermont, because I spent a lot of time watching through some of the advisory committee meetings and things of that nature, and I see that you guys have popped in to sort of, let your voices be heard throughout that process, and I'd love to really dive into sort of maybe where the medical program is at right now and where you would like to see it headed in the future here.
Yeah, totally. I will say, damn, aren't those subcommittee meetings fun to sit through?
No comment.
Yeah, that was such a crazy process. And you'll notice the very blatant lack of patient voices in all of those meetings. I mean, aside from Jim Romanoff, who is the dispensary appointed patient. So
yeah, and I noticed even, I mean, whatever, Mary Clifton seemed a little unhinged to me. But she was the first person to suggest bringing in some patients, and I don't know if that was on your advice, but I understand that you guys talked to her, and I thought that was the first reasonable sort of piece of advice that I had heard throughout those whole proceedings. Like, hey, let's get some patients in here and see how they feel.
Yeah, I mean, we did get a chance to sit down with Dr. Clifton. She's very enthusiastic and super down for the cause. But I think that, without going into a lot of detail, she was removed from that subcommittee after she started doing things like advocating for patient voices. Specifically after she started advocating for caregiver rights and our caregiver platform, she was very conveniently removed from that subcommittee.
Which I've just got to in the recordings. And to me personally, it was, I thought that she had a lot of ideas that I did not care for at all leading up to that. And here she came with a really good idea, which was just dismissed by both the subcommittee and the consulting firms, I thought.
Yeah. And I mean, it makes sense, when you're talking to people whose bottom line is directly threatened by the ideas that you're presenting, they're probably not going to support them. I don't think it's any secret that fairly compensating caregivers and allowing caregivers to have more patients is going to directly threaten, medical sales. Hey, chill.
And that was definitely one of the big points of contention. It seemed like was the home grower or caretaker. It seemed like they even tried to redefine the definition of caretaker at one point.
They wanted to bifurcate the definition of caregiver into two separate definitions. So you would have a cultivating caregiver, and you were only allowed to have one of those, and you could have like an administrating caregiver who could shop for you, administer cannabis, etc. And they wanted you to have an unlimited number of those. And so, everybody should have an unlimited number of people who can administer and buy cannabis for them. I think that's great. But I also think that one cultivating caregiver is not enough. Right now we're advocating for each patient to be allowed to have up to 3 cultivating caregivers. And each cultivating caregiver, we'll get into the whole caregiver breakdown of what we're proposing right now. But I think that there's a lot of wiggle room in
even 3 seems low to me.
Well, so here's the thing. If we're going to, and even if we aren't going to, but when we expand the caregiver program, we also need to look at the way that we have regulated that caregiver program up until now. So right now there is no required education, required testing, anything like that as far as caregivers are concerned. And I think that's largely due to the fact that they don't sell their product. So it's not a product that's being brought to a market, therefore it's not, under market regulation.
Mm.
So we do feel strongly that caregivers need to be educated, like bare minimum, caregivers need to be educated. And if they're going to be fairly compensated for their product, we know that the pushback on that is that their product needs to be tested, which cool, for consumer safety. Yeah. Um, I think anything patients are interacting with should be tested. Um, but the biggest pushback, I think, from the medical subcommittee, and I mean this awful line of thought that I keep hearing, is if caregivers want to be compensated, they should just get a cultivation license. And it's not the same thing. It is not the same thing at all. We're talking about the entire Vermont market versus 3 to up to what we're proposing is like, you know, 5 to 10 people, so it's just you can't compare the two. It's
Right.
not the same as getting a
Well,
cultivation.
you don't need 1,000 square feet to take
Yeah,
care of a few patients,
yeah.
which would
So
be incredibly, I assume, would be kind of cost prohibitive if that is indeed what they were proposing.
yeah, and I mean, I think that there are plenty of people who don't want to be cultivators. There are plenty of people who don't want to open a facility, who don't want to go through the packaging and through the fucking dosing requirements and all of that. There are people who just want to grow and provide medicine to patients.
Mm,
Um, and maybe grow enough for themselves and their families as well. So I
mm.
think I think it's way overdue that we allow these people who are already providing like a really necessary service in the patient community to be to be compensated for that service, like they are in Maine and many other states.
Mm. Sure. What about like a state subsidy for a program like that? Is that something you would be into?
I mean, so as far as I'm aware, it's still around this number. It might have grown since, I've been talking about this for 2 years, but there is around $400,000 in the medical marijuana fund.
Mm.
And Jesse Lynn, Jeffrey, and I have continued to offer very good use for that fund, as it has never been put to use in the history of the medical cannabis program.
And I have this in my notes to ask about the medical fund. Um,
Yeah,
way to beat me to the question.
I do what I can. Yeah, so I mean, we have a very large chunk of money that has just been sitting there and has never been put to good use, has never been used to directly affect the lives of patients or make it easier for them to access their medicine. The only thing that fund has ever been used for is to remove $300,000 from to go into the general fund when the state of Vermont fucked up their budget. So, I think we could definitely subsidize, caregiver testing with that money. I think that would be a great use for it.
Mm.
We could subsidize medical cards with that money. Another great use for it. There are so many things that we could do with that money, but unfortunately, the CCB can't just decide what to do with it, because I believe it's still currently being held in the Department of Public Safety.
No shit.
Um, I'm not sure that it's moved over into the CCB's
Mm.
general cannabis fund yet.
Okay.
Um, so as far as I'm aware, right now, currently, the CCB has no control over that money. It's just sitting there. I believe it's continuing to grow. I don't like, I might not be correct about that, but I believe that patient card funds are still going into that fund, because that fund is made up of the dispensary's license fees and patient and caregiver
Mm.
card fees.
And I know some of the funds, and I don't want to say this explicitly about this fund, but I know some of them for the state of Vermont, for sure, if they sit there long enough, it just gets absorbed back into the general fund if it's not used.
Well, and that's what happened in, I believe, 2017, when $300,000 of the medical marijuana fund got moved. The state's, their reasoning was basically nothing was happening with this money, and the state needed it. The fucked up thing is it's not tax money. So that is not a fund that is built through tax money. That is a fund that is literally built through patients' fees and the dispensary fees. And it was, originally intended to be put toward benefiting patients and benefiting the members of the program. Um, so yeah, I think when you talk about, can we subsidize this caregiver program, we absolutely could. But it's going to take a lot more than just the CCB saying, yeah, that's okay, let's do it.
Mm. And let me ask you this, because from what I've read, the original definitions of what is a qualifying condition was determined by the legislature here in Vermont and not by medical professionals. Is that accurate?
Um, I mean, I'm sure there were medical professionals involved, you
Yeah,
know,
Mark Levine. Hey, Mark,
hey,
still like an interview.
we get Jess involved all the time, as our healthcare professional through GMPA. And the issue with the system that we're currently using is that it is condition based rather than symptom based. And if we could move over into a symptom based decision making process for who gets a card, we would open that up to so many more people who currently are being excluded from the program who shouldn't be. I've talked about this in public comments, but if we look at PTSD, and
That was one of the big ones for sure.
yeah, well, yeah, and I feel like this is probably like the easiest way to break this down. Overall, a diagnosis is a set of symptoms. If you have XYZ, if you have chronic pain, insomnia, and inflammation in your gut, you're probably going to get diagnosed with some form of IBS, Crohn's, etc. And it's because you see all of those symptoms present. So if we go back to PTSD, what are we using cannabis to treat in PTSD or to relieve the symptoms of? We're looking at things like insomnia, panic attacks, anxiety, depression, chronic pain, things that veterans specifically, let's say, are already on, a cocktail of medications for because the VA can't legally, prescribe cannabis.
Yep.
And so when we move from this kind of condition-based system into a symptom-based system, all of a sudden, if we look at PTSD, that opens up anxiety as a qualifying symptom, depression, panic attacks, insomnia, So I think that what we need to be doing is looking at the conditions that we've already approved and say, what is it about these conditions? What symptoms are we looking to relieve the pain or stress of? And then just break that down, because what we're currently doing is this really arbitrary method of every few years we add a new condition, and all the sick people in Vermont get to enter the lottery.
And based on the thoughts of some legislators who might not necessarily be qualified to sort of diagnose medical conditions.
Yeah. And I mean, every single time that a condition has been added to the qualifying list is because a patient has come forward and said, I need this to be able to live my life. Yeah. So when PTSD was even introduced, it was actually with Virginia Renfrew, who worked with a patient with PTSD and brought them into the legislature and lobbied for that, and they got that changed, which I think is amazing. But again, we've got to stop thinking about this as singular conditions, because if we do that, it's going to take us 50 years to get to a place where we've even got most of the people in Vermont covered.
That's a great point right there.
Totally.
Interesting. You have given me stuff to think about.
I do what I can.
Now, in terms of what else I've watched sort of play out in the medical arena, it seems like the medical dispensaries have sort of been exempted from a lot of the rules that are going to cost retail dispensaries a lot of money, like the vape tax or the packaging for edibles and things like that. From where I'm sitting, that seemed intentional. It seemed like it was designed to help those folks make more money. Otherwise, why would those be in place? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts. So I think that the first thing we have to recognize is that patients not having to pay taxes, whether it be on vapes or their products in general, and patients not having to deal with the THC caps through the medical dispensaries are both good things. Yes. We don't want patients to be paying taxes, and we don't want patients to be having to adhere to these THC caps. The issue comes in when nobody in the adult use market can provide any of these things for patients without having some sort of medical license. And there was a point in time when we could not open another medical dispensary in Vermont until we had 7,000 patients on the registry, which was a huge problem because we weren't even getting new patients on the registry. The number was dropping every single year.
Right.
And at one point we were at like 4,300 patients. So getting to 7,000 just to get that one more medical dispensary was like unthinkable. That is no longer true. That rule has kind of dissolved into oblivion with the takeover by the CCB. And so now anybody could open a medical designated dispensary. But when you look at the overwhelming fees, the issues with banking, the regulations, the packaging, everything that goes into opening a dispensary in the state of Vermont, especially a vertically integrated medical dispensary, who's going to do that when they could just open an adult use dispensary? And so what we're seeing now is, you know, a lot of the farmers I've talked to, a lot of the retailers are planning on opening and covering the taxes for patients so that the patient isn't paying that 14% cannabis tax, you know? And I think
So
that is
you've
awesome.
got retailers that are going to like take that on the chin and wow, no shit.
I absolutely have. And I think that's awesome. I think that shows how much the community cares about patients, but I don't think that onus should be on the retailers.
And I don't think that's and personally, sorry to interrupt you, but I don't think that's necessarily sustainable for business owners.
No, I don't think so either. I think that it's a huge heart. These people have huge hearts and they want to help and they recognize the issue. They should not have to be put in that position. And you know, we've talked about this. I'm advocating for things like, you know, no taxes with a medical card in adult use dispensaries. If you have a medical card and you go into one of these adult use dispensaries, you should not have to pay that 14% cannabis tax.
And can I stop you right there? Because that's something that I heard a lot about this argument. Was there a lot of pushback when you guys presented this argument, or how did that go?
Oh, of course. I mean, when we talk about things that are going to affect the dispensary's bottom line, that is one of the biggest ones, is that if a patient can go anywhere and not pay the 14% cannabis tax, why would they go to the medical dispensary? You know? And I mean, we'll see in these next, you know, coming month or two what the overall price structure of adult use cannabis looks like. I think for the next year, it really is going to be a grower's market. I think that the demand is, you know, far going to outweigh the supply, as we've already seen, as we saw on opening day. And so patients are going to be facing this really hard decision of, is my local medical dispensary going to have what I need? Is the product that I want even legal for me to buy on the adult use market? Or am I stuck continuing to go to these medical dispensaries run by multi-billion-dollar multinational out-of-state corporations? So it's really shitty. I think eliminating that tax for patients is a really good first step in the adult use market.
I agree. And I haven't met anyone with an ounce of sense that disagrees with that measure.
Yeah. And I mean, the CCB, I've heard them agree with me on this. The problem is, again, if we do this, it is going to affect the medical dispensary's bottom line so much that they might close, or they might no longer choose to operate as a medical dispensary, and they might pull back into just being in the adult use market. I say, fine.
Yeah, and that my question was, who cares?
Well, here's the issue, and I think it's a fair point that James Pepper brought up in one of the last meetings that we spoke about medical. If, say, Series Med closes or stops being a medical designated dispensary, 75% of Vermont patients use Series Med. And that is only to say 75% of the patients who utilize the dispensaries use Series Med.
Sure.
I think that's an important distinction to make. But if Series all of a sudden stops, you know, operating as a medical dispensary, that also means they lose the ability to offer high potency solid concentrates, high potency edibles, you know, above 30% flower.
But it does seem like that's sort of a carrot that they dangle out here, like, hey, if we closed, God, you guys would be in a lot of trouble. but from all accounts that I've heard, especially from CBD, is just a lot of moldy weed coming out of there, and things that you wouldn't want medical patients to have access to.
So listen, when we talk about the moldy weed issue, here's the thing. They are under new management. They have cleaned house, and we can only speculate as to what is currently happening.
Sure, yeah, and
Unless we
I
hear
spoke to Russell too at
yeah,
Sirius, and I gotta give Russell a bonus point for reaching out because nobody else has.
yeah. And so the thing is, I think we absolutely need to talk about what has happened because we've got photographic evidence, we've got media coverage, we know exactly the entire history of these companies in the state of Vermont.
Mhm.
But we all have to also agree that when we talk about moldy weed, you know, potency issues, labeling issues, etc., a lot of that is currently speculation. We can talk about what is absolutely happening in other states. You know, we can talk about Curaleaf stealing their employees' tips. We can talk about Curaleaf's potency issues, their labeling issues in Vermont. You
Mhm.
know, and we can talk about Series and their acquisition by Slang, 17 million of which was funded by Trulieve, who
Mhm.
just had an employee in Massachusetts die from inhalation of heat.
I'm glad you brought that up because yeah,
Like,
I got the family coming on later this week.
damn,
Yeah,
yeah. My respects to them and my
yeah,
my condolences because that's
yeah.
awful.
That was a tragic story to read.
It really was. And so we can absolutely hold these companies accountable. Um, and we can talk about what's been done, but we also have to just be realistic that when we say that we know things for certain right now, we really don't.
Mm.
And I don't want people to kind of wander into that like gray territory of potentially being sued because they're accusing a company of like
Sure,
currently doing
sure.
something.
And I also don't like hey, that's why I try to get in touch with Russell from
Yeah,
Sirius. I said, hey man, like I don't want to spit rumors out about you. Like you guys
yeah,
got new management. Like let's come on, we'll
yeah,
have a talk about it. Like I think for sure some people in Vermont, especially medical patients, would like to hear some kind of assurances that that's not the same kind of shit that they're going to see coming out of the adult use
yeah.
dispensary from the same companies.
Well, and at the same time, these companies need to understand, as I'm sure they already do, they're never going to get the trust back from a lot of people. It's just not going to happen. Some people are never going to go to Serious Med ever again, myself included. It's just never going to happen. Um, and that is because, you know, impact versus intent, right? Your impact matters so much more than your intent. And
Mm.
the impact that that company and its predecessors before it's been sold and changed and all of this, that impact matters so much more than what they intend to do in the future.
Mm.
You know,
And
I was there when the moldy weed thing got. I was a patient at CBD. I was smoking that weed. Um, and if you think about like the sheer amount of danger that they put patients in throughout that whole thing, you know, I'm already immunocompromised, but could you imagine a patient with cancer or somebody who is literally like their immune system is failing, smoking moldy weed? Like we can talk about that until the end of fucking time, until that company is no longer operating within this state. But we can only speculate as to what's happening now.
well, I mean, I see some of their former employees are now teaching at Vermont colleges and teaching other people how to grow weed, and I just think, goddamn, like there's so many other people we could have kind of pegged for that job. You know,
Yeah.
people that actually grow good weed and that could actually help patients. And then it got quiet.
Yeah. um yeah, I think look, I understand I spend a lot of my time harping on the medical dispensaries. I, I don't think that they are going to be a part of the medical program expanding into a place that is accessible for everybody. I don't foresee that. I foresee our medical program and community being supported by small local growers,
Mm,
caregivers, patients, patient advocates, and healthcare professionals like Jessie Lynn.
mm,
I have said many times at this point that I think that going into a dispensary and buying cannabis is a function of the medical program, but it is not the purpose. And we have made it the purpose of the medical program. The purpose of getting a card is so that you can walk into a medical dispensary and buy weed. And that's not right. It's not patient-centered.
And that was the one, that was the Mary Clifton point, was, hey, maybe we should take a look at the patient-centered models. And I don't know if that was, again, maybe your wisdom coming through her, but I thought that was a great idea.
It is. And I think that anytime you're talking about a group of people who are marginalized in any sort of way, whether it be by health, skin color, sexuality, anything, those people need to be centered both in the discussion and the solution. Why is $1 billion corporation being centered in the discussion of medical cannabis? Why is it not medical patients? It makes no sense. It's greed.
You're asking the questions here. I'm
Who's interviewing who here?
I mean, and it's a good question though. Like, why? Where are all the growers? Where are all the patients? Like, in the whole chain of command, the way this whole thing has played out since back to the Phil Scott's marijuana commission in 2017, it seems like there's more cops in the room than there are weed growers.
Well, I think there is a generation in place of power right now, and that exchange of power is not going to be finished happening for another 5 to 10 years. And when that generational exchange of power happens, we are going to see a much different priority in cannabis. Right now, there's a lot of fear-based bias politics that happen that put law enforcement officials at the forefront of cannabis regulation. I don't think it's right. I don't think that law enforcement officials are educated properly about cannabis at all. Something I worry about is as we get into this legal market, Vermont has roadside testing written into its legislation. And I've been told by legislators that I don't need to worry about it, that nobody's talking about it. And cool, if nobody's talking about it, that is our best case solution.
If no one's talking about it, why are they training new drug recognition experts right now to detect signs of impairment from cannabis?
And my issue with that is when we look at the diagnosis of various neurodivergent traits and various neurodivergent mental illnesses, disabilities, we look at things like autism, Tourette syndrome, PTSD, ADHD. People are being diagnosed as neurodivergent at astronomically higher rates within the last 3 to 5 years than we ever have previously. And so if you look at somebody who is autistic and you pull them over under the suspicion of, cannabis impairment, that officer is going to be looking for things like, can you make eye contact? Do you fumble with your hands? Do you stutter your words? Are you speaking in a slow or not, typical speech pattern? And all of these things are also found in things like autism, ADHD, Tourette syndrome, PTSD. We talk about PTSD. How can somebody make eye contact with an officer if they have PTSD from previous interactions with police officers? How are you going to accurately determine whether somebody is actually impaired through their use of cannabis?
And even according to the state's own consulting team at the NACB, he said there is no scientific consensus across the board as to what impairment looks like when it comes to cannabis. So why are we training cops to sort of pretend to know what that looks like?
And I mean, Jessie Lynn is big on it. I say it all the time. The answer to recklessness within cannabis is not persecution, it's education. All right, we can punish people all day long for doing dumb shit.
But how well has that gone?
How well has that ever gone? It's the behavior repeats. And I feel like that's the way society is built, is they depend on that behavior repeating to then invest in the jail industrial complex. But I think that when we talk about people who are, say, smoking while they're driving, that can be I don't know, fixed is the right word. I don't think that'll ever be completely 100% nobody smokes while they drive. I don't think that's ever going to be the case. But I think that we can encourage people to be a lot more responsible and conscious about their cannabis use through education. A lot of people are figuring this out on their own. A lot of us figured out how to get stoned on our own, out back of our parents' house, using the bowl that we hid somewhere, or with our friends walking around somewhere. I don't think that cannabis education classes were available to most of us when we were learning how to smoke.
So let me ask you this, and I've heard some of y'all's comments on the Department of Health sort of education. Do you feel like the state's version of cannabis education is sufficient?
I think that the state's version of cannabis education relies on prevention rather than safe use and harm reduction. So I think that when all we do is say, do not use this, do not use this, do not let your children use this, do not let your children near this, do not talk about this with your children, use dosages so small that you don't actually receive the benefits of this, etc. I think when we come at it from that angle, I mean, you and I both know that DARE failed. So, I think rather than just the constant prevention language that is being bombarded at us, get real cannabis educators in these positions, like Jessie Lynn, who is currently running the only state-approved bud tender training.
And when I look at sort of the messaging that she provides as opposed to the messaging that I've seen from the Department of Health, it's very different.
Yeah.
And I would like to see, and look, I don't even necessarily mind if you throw a prohibitionist in here and there. But like for me, it would be important to see a balance, a range of accepted opinions, as opposed to just the reefer madness, which I still am seeing a lot of here.
And you're going to continue to, like I said, the people that are currently in a position of power are of a certain generation and a certain bias and mindset. And that exchange of power into the generation below them is not going to be done for another 5 to 10 years.
And I don't even blame them necessarily, because I feel like a lot of that generation was sort of the guinea pigs for this sort of propaganda. And in a way, I know that's a tough one, but in a way, I sort of feel for them.
I think that a lot of and what we're talking about right now is my parents' and grandparents' generations. My mom is 60. Oh God, I hope she doesn't watch this. My mom is 62 this year. And so, she's like the very tail end of the boomer generation. And her parents before her were the Great Depression kids, And I think that those two generations specifically, after, William Randolph Hearst and the cannabis panic, my grandparents' generation was the first generation to grow up within that kind of propaganda and messaging. To his credit, my granddad doesn't give a fuck. He's an old carpenter, old storyteller, old hippie. My granddad and my parents, they could not care less about cannabis use or cannabis legalization. I think that is largely in part due to the fact that they've got a couple sick kids that use it as medicine, and they kind of had to learn up pretty fast because it was not going anywhere. But I know a lot of my friends who say that they can't smoke in front of their parents or around their families because some of them feel like they'll be disowned. Is
that something you'd like to see, the public consumption?
I would like to see responsible public consumption. Something that worries me is the only thing that worries me about public consumption is the mixing of substances. So I don't want to see bars start allowing public cannabis consumption without a pretty good plan in place for what we're going to do when somebody gets crossfaded,
Crossfaded. I've never heard that. I like that.
I don't want to see accidents happening, it getting blamed on the cannabis in somebody's system as well as the alcohol. I don't want to see, when you get the spins because you're drunk and stoned at the same time, I don't want to see people vomiting everywhere and causing a public health crisis or passing out.
It does seem like sort of the state is maybe looking for an excuse
Yeah,
to jump down people's backs, and maybe we should not give them one.
exactly. I think that there is obviously a level at which people should be able to make their own decisions and take personal responsibility for their own health and safety. That I think that's a no-brainer, and that comes with all drug legalization. Um, but there is also a point, and I say this about cannabis events too. There is a point in which the proprietor has to take a certain level of responsibility for the safety of the attendees or the people that are establishing your place of business.
Mm.
So
And
I think
I really like those comments, by the way. I remember you saying that a while back, and I thought those were very poignant. Is that the word?
totally,
Pointed, yeah,
articulated.
on point.
Yeah, and I think again, it's a learning process. None of us were educated about cannabis, and we are all just learning it for ourselves from our elders. You know, all of us learned to grow from some old hippie. That's just the way it goes. And if you don't have an old hippie in your life teaching you how to grow, I'm not convinced that
Yeah.
you have a very good understanding of cannabis.
Get one.
Get one. If you don't have an old hippie, get one. Um, I think that the generational knowledge that's been passed down has been great, but it hasn't been complete. We've got this generation of people who kind of are just doing like pass or fail experiments with cannabis to figure out what the fuck's going on with it. And now with scientific advancement and research, we have this other community of people who are like, I know how to scientifically make you a dab that will fuck you up. And the other generations, like, we used to smoke finger hash. So it's like, you know, I think
I've smoked finger hash.
we all have. And I think that, the more that we combine these two practices of we need to maintain this generational knowledge,
Mm.
people need to learn about the ancient art of things like hashish. And people need to know the old school grower tricks for when the world collapses and plastic runs out and nobody can get bottle newts anymore. You know, we need this knowledge, but we also need people to come into the education of this is what is safe, this is how these chemicals work, this is how they affect your brain, this is what dosage looks like, this is what different terpenes do, this is how you can mix those two things to get the exact effect that you want. So I think that there is a point of preciseness, and there's that generational knowledge, and when those two things finally come together within one generation, I feel like it'll be either ours or the next one. We're really going to come to a place where not only is cannabis seen as something that is just part of daily life and daily use, but it's also seen as like what I truly believe is medicine. And when I say everyone's a patient, I mean that every single person that uses cannabis is a patient.
Mm. This is where the art and the science come together.
Totally.
Yeah. All right, Amelia, I'm out of questions, and I want to thank you again for your time today.
Yeah.
As always, I feel like, boy, of all the people I've spent time on the phone with, you're the person I've never met that I've spent the most time on the phone. But I always leave the last word for my guests, and this is all you, Amelia Grace, Can Amelia. Check her out on Instagram, please. Thank you so much again for your time, please.
Yeah, we've got Green Mountain Patients Alliance. I am their communications director. We've got an event coming up on October 23rd at 10 o'clock. It's going to be at the Hickok Garden Supply, which will be opening soon. And it's going to be kind of a patient grower mixer. So it's a community building event. We're going to get patients and growers in the same room, and they're going to learn how they can access each other and help each other. And that's really all it is. There's no vendors, nothing's for sale. We've got some awesome sponsors that have helped make it happen. Ticket sales are dropping today at 5. So today's Friday at 5. And they will be pretty limited because this is our first event and we're just seeing how things go. So if people want to attend, they're going to have to get their tickets quick.
Where do you get the tickets?
greenmountainpatients.com/events.
Very good.
Yeah.
Amelia, thanks so much for your time again, and I will get this up as soon as we can, man. Take care.
Awesome. Have a good one.
Wonderful. Well, this guy's gonna cut out, but